soccer, football, whatever you want to call it, it's not my thing at all. Give me baseball every day, 365 days a week. But what is my thing is obviously making sure that workers in every sport aren't exploited. And that has been a thing for years when it came to the rights of workers who worked on the staging of soccer's quadrennial World Cup, including the upcoming one in 2022 in Qatar. A worldwide outcry put a brake on some of the worst abuses in Qatar and set the stage for even more workers' protections in the 2026 World Cup, which will be staged in North America and Mexico. And it's not too early to check in on how that campaign is shaping up. And over in Europe, a move is afoot to make sure that workers on so-called digital platforms aren't exploited by the likes of Uber. And we get a report from Paris in a chat on this topic with a leader in that movement. This is Jonathan Tassini, and it's great to have you with us for our show for December 9th, 2020. Hey, if you missed Giving Tuesday and you've been benefiting from the information in this podcast, I have the perfect solution. Go over to workinglife.org, look for the podcast tab, and click over there and you will see a link to Patreon where you can sign up as a one-time sponsor or a monthly supporter of this show. Or you can do the same thing by using ActBlue because we've partnered up with ActBlue. So go over to ActBlue, look for Working Life with Jonathan Tassini, and there you can also become a one-time sponsor or monthly sponsor. Also a reminder that I've launched an e-newsletter which you can subscribe to at Substack. It's called Surprise Working Life, and it's part of the overall Working Life platform. Now, eventually the newsletter will soon be behind a paywall, and for all of the folks who sign up before the paywall goes up, well, I'm going to give you a little break on the cost. Now, you might want to check out a recent post I made there, which asks the basic question, general strike, if not now, when? Consider this. Unemployment benefits will expire in the next couple of weeks. Rent and mortgage payment freezes will expire in a couple of weeks, and then more people will become houseless. No more pandemic-era paid sick and paid leave in a couple of weeks. And more people won't have money to pay for food. Personal bankruptcies will go up then, and debt will deepen. And in turn, more people will lose their jobs because the economy will weaken. Even more because whether we like it or not, 2/3 of the economy is powered by consumer spending. The same consumers who continue to spend mainly because of these stimulus payments. And then you've got the state and local governments who will have to cut even more deeply. And I forecasted this long ago, which will mean deep cuts to public workers' jobs, which will disproportionately hurt workers of color. Yes, this whole nickel and dime approach by our politicians to fully supporting the people is deeply racist. And then take into account the carnage in the workplace, which will continue. The workplace is one of the main vectors of COVID-19 spread, and yet there are basically no federal standards protecting workers who get sick and carry the virus into the community. Now, faced with all that, the people have been abandoned by political leadership at every level. To me, the only barrier to a general strike is you need leadership. And to date, that leadership, especially from my friends in the labor movement, has not been forthcoming. Even Black Lives Matter didn't just erupt one day over one killing. It grew and became a potent force over time with a strong set of leaders who, although they emphasized that Black Lives Matter is decentralized, in other words, not a top-down organization, they've still built a lot of organizational, what I call connective tissue. Now, we shouldn't kick that ball down the road. We need to start building the conditions now for a massive national walkout. Now, speaking of kicking a ball down the road, and you know that that was a total setup, right, for a transition, you may have caught in the past couple of years a global outcry about what was up with people who were working on the 2022 World Cup. Mostly migrant workers, they faced just horrible conditions, working as essentially slaves with wages that were being kept and stolen from them, passports taken away so they couldn't leave home for their home countries, and supremely dangerous work sites where workers were being hurt and killed every single day. The outcry made a big difference, even if, frankly, some of the things that the Qatari government agreed to have not been enforced entirely. The 2022 World Cup campaign did put tremendous pressure on the Fédération Internationale de Football Association. You can see my French is terrible, better known as FIFA, to clean up its act on workers' conditions. And that isn't easy because, as you might know, FIFA is one of the most corrupt international groups, with bribes exchanging hands between countries as a way of doing daily business. The pressure meant that the 2026 World Cup will have, at least on the surface, a much clearer mandate to defend workers' rights. And when I say on the surface, I mean this. What's on paper won't mean a damn if there isn't a sustained campaign starting now, even if it's 6 years away, to hold the host countries, that's the United States, Canada, and Mexico, to hold their collective feet to the fire. Now, to talk about that campaign, it's always a pleasure to have on the show Cathy Feingold, the International Affairs Director of the AFL-CIO and the Deputy President of the International Trade Union Confederation. So this is a really incredible topic to discuss, Cathy, because I remember, as they say, I'm old enough to remember this incredible scandal that happened with actually the upcoming World Cup in 2022 and the horrendous conditions that migrant workers faced, especially in Qatar, as they started building the stadiums. And as you know, there was the terrible, I'm reading from a report here, the kafala system, which basically bound foreign workers to their employers. As you well know, there was no right to organize, really. And there was a huge campaign that you were a part of and the labor movement was a part of to pressure Qatar into abiding under some conditions. So let's give a little bit of background to that before we then jump forward 4 years to this incredible, really, step forward.
Sure. No, it's a really important campaign because the labor movement has always called out egregious worker rights violations in mega sporting events. Let's be clear, it's not just the World Cup, it's football games, it's the Olympics. So when Qatar, one of the most repressive countries when it comes to worker rights, bid on the 2022 World Cup, the labor movement really was concerned. And we ran a campaign called Rerun the Vote. We didn't think that Qatar should have received it. We know why they received it, because they had lots of money to pay FIFA. And they did not care about worker rights. And migrant workers from Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, come into Qatar, and they're forced to build these stadiums and turn over their passports. They have no freedom under the kafala system. Now, over the years of pressure campaign, the good news is just this past year, we were able to pressure the government to start ending the kafala system. So there has been some improvement. There are some worker committees that have been built of migrant workers in Qatar. We still have a long way to go, but there have been improvements. And now we got a global acknowledgement that you have to have rights in mega sporting events.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you mentioned that Qatar had a lot of money, that essentially means they were bribing, for lack of a better term, FIFA,
Right.
because as you and I talked about before we started recording here, FIFA is one of the most corrupt international organizations you could point to. Now, before we go to the next 4 years in 2026 and what you've established, let's just stick with Qatar. As I'm reading some of the conditions, it's hard to enforce them. There's some reporting that's come out in the last few months. I was reading a report by Amnesty, for example, that there's still problems with the right to organize. There's still problems with wages being withheld. So it's not as if all the problems have been solved, right?
So Qatar, absolutely, we have seen some improvements, but there's still a long way to go. You do not change something like the kafala system overnight. But what we did accomplish was the government has recognized they must dismantle the system. The corporate sponsors recognize that they cannot be part of supporting a system that represses the rights of migrant workers. So yes, migrant workers are still struggling to organize. There still are not independent unions in Qatar. A lot of work to go, but some initial steps were taken.
Now, one other point about Qatar, it's not just that folks were not being paid, they couldn't organize. They were literally being killed in those construction sites. It was a extremely dangerous work site, right? And there was no protections.
Correct. No health and safety protections. There were multinational construction companies there
Yeah.
who know better, right? Who, if they're in other countries of the world, would have never permitted workers to work under these conditions. And I would say, out of this experience, the global labor movement, the International Trade Union Confederation, working with some corporate sponsors and others, out of this experience, created a global institution, the Center for Sports and Human Rights, to maintain a focus on mega sporting events and ensure that these games are not permitted to violate worker and human rights.
And now let's go forward. We're looking at 4 years from now. And this is really established, from your point of view, an incredible base from which to then enforce a whole set of standards for the games that are coming up in 2026, which I believe are being shared by the United States, Canada, and Mexico.
Right. So it's a really unique bid. The United States, Canada, and Mexico put forward a bid against Morocco to host the 2026 World Cup. And one of the things these three countries did was they agreed to the most robust human and worker rights language that's ever been negotiated in a bid for any mega sporting event. And so, they've got 6 pages alone in commitments that any host city must uphold just on worker rights, not to mention the LGBTQ rights, immigrant rights, and a whole robust set of rights that have to be upheld in each of the host cities.
Now, let's share a screen here to show folks what you're talking about in terms of where the actual World Cup is going to be held, so people get a visual idea of that. So the first thing is that, and for my audio listeners, you'll be able to see this online. We've got a map up of all the places that are competing in the metro regions of the United States, and then also 6 in Mexico and Canada. So talk briefly about the logistics of that.
Sure. One of the things, each country had to commit that they were not going to build new stadiums. So this is not like, Qatar, they were building new stadiums. Here, all three countries said, we have basic infrastructure. So you'll see the 3 cities in Canada have been selected: Toronto, Montreal, Edmonton. In Mexico, the 3 cities have been selected: Monterrey, Guadalajara, and Mexico City. That leaves, in the US, we are probably going to choose 10 host cities. Currently, there are 17 that are in the bidding process. Part of the bidding process includes they must show how they have engaged stakeholders, including the labor movement, and how they're ready to implement the it's called the United 2026 Human Rights Commitments.
Mm-hmm. And so let's go to that slide that you have on the metrics about human rights, the basic ideas, the metrics on worker rights identified by United 2026, and let's quickly touch on each of those points.
And you can, see it. It's online, so anyone that really wants to dig in, it's 6 pages here. But the metrics are quite robust. Looking at current or proposed policies that restrict worker rights. Think about those cities we just saw. There's right to work up there. There are places like Texas, where Dallas and Houston are bidding, where they try to outlaw project labor agreements. So there's lots to look at here. Existing efforts around procurement. What does it look like to embed labor and human rights into city contracts, collective bargaining agreements, project labor agreements, contractors' labor rights records? That's a huge one. Policies to address harassment at work. And this is a great one. Policies that give temporary and subcontracted workers the same rights as all employees. As you know, this is a big issue in our country around the misclassification of workers and who gets rights and who doesn't. Current minimum wage policy. You saw Atlanta up there. Atlanta's got no minimum wage, doesn't have a minimum wage policy. It follows the federal policy, very low. And so these are all really important issues that local labor movements with their allies should be raising right now as cities are in their stakeholder process. Let me just show you the other broader human rights commitments. We've seen in the past years how stadiums actually sometimes become the place of racist and homophobic chanting. And so they're going to prevent that. They need to show what they're doing around racial justice, huge issue in our country. Accessibility issues, privacy issues, security services goes to some of the policing issues and housing rights. So this is the most robust language I have ever seen linked to a mega sporting event. So the labor movement is in the process right now, as we speak, of engaging locally in a stakeholder set of meetings And then those cities have to tell FIFA, what it is, how they've engaged the stakeholders, and what their plans are to meet these commitments.
Hmm. And it's great that we, the labor movement, you as a leader on this project, have 6 years to make this happen, but probably fewer because it all has to be in place before all these sites are selected. So I'm going to play the skeptic for a moment.
Okay.
And when you were talking about the three countries, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, I felt like there was a parallel to the debate that happened around NAFTA. And
Right.
in this sense, Canada, as you well know, and I'm explaining this more to my audience, not to you, because you're really an expert in this area. Canada has a much more robust labor rights regime compared to the United States and Mexico. The U.S., as you well know, is pretty rickety, and it often has to do with who's in power. We're going to get to that in a second. And then Mexico has had a very, very dicey relationship with labor laws. They say that they are trying to enforce the labor laws. Now I'm speaking under NAFTA. So why shouldn't people be skeptical that this is great on paper? This is a great thing to achieve for the labor movement to set these standards. But how is this going to actually get enforced?
Well, I think we do need to be skeptical. That's our job as a movement, to be skeptical. We will not take anything as face value, that just because we have beautiful words on a piece of paper, we know better than that. Our job as a movement is to enforce those words. And so the AFL-CIO is working with our state federations and local labor bodies to proactively put forward an agenda. And we're working with our local allies as well. We're not waiting for FIFA to tell us what we should think, but we're saying, in each city, here's what we need to see have happen. In San Francisco, there were conflicts at the stadium around wage issues. Well, that has to be resolved if that city wants to win the bid. Obviously, lots of issues in Atlanta, right to work issues. Now, we don't expect right to work to necessarily be resolved through the FIFA process, but it should be raised. These should be debated at the city level. And lastly, I would say, FIFA is a very corrupt organization that has been in the press. So we don't want to take everything they say at face value. We have to hold them accountable. And they've also continued their process out of sync with the reality of what's happening in all three countries, where states, because of the pandemic, are missing a lot of important resources. So a lot of people are questioning, if FIFA comes to our city, what happens to our transit? What happens to, are they going to ask for more money than they give back? Are we going to make investments? Are the hotel workers who've been laid off going to be called back to work? Are they going to be union? Lots of questions that we need answers to before the labor movement says we agree to supporting these games in our cities.
And do you have veto power? Can the labor movement say, no, this is not good, and basically say these cities should not be awarded?
We unfortunately do not have veto power. What we do have is the power to raise a lot of awareness around the process. So right now, the timeline is all stakeholder meetings have to be finished by the end of January. And then in the next months, FIFA will review. I mean, each city has glossy things they're promising. And then they're going to make their decision about which city gets it. At that point, the labor movement has a lot of work to do with our allies, organizing, looking at various sectors and contracts. And so we're really going to be on this, looking at how it builds power for workers and how workers get their fair share.
So does it help that you have a more friendly administration coming into power? Would a Biden administration and presumably a labor department, for example, have some sway and say that is much more than effective than obviously the outgoing administration?
Absolutely, we would hope so. I think this administration has already said this incoming administration has said that they have a strong commitment to policies that work for working people and the environment. And so our expectation is when FIFA comes pressuring for tax breaks, or traditionally FIFA has a special FIFA law, which that gets them out of a lot of liability measures. How the national government deals with that will be a really important signal. So we are hopeful. And I would just say that what else is at stake here is we're trying to create the model for all mega sporting events going forward. LA will be hosting the Olympics. We don't want to start from square one. When the Olympics come to LA, we're going to say to them, here's the language. Here's where you should be starting.
And you were telepathic in two respects in speaking about these issues. The first is I remember when Amazon just recently had this incredible competition to cite its HQ2, its second big headquarters. And I just remember these cities and states falling over themselves to give Amazon whatever it wanted, especially when it came to tax breaks. And when you mention FIFA tries to get these tax breaks, this is my concern. One of my concerns would be that you'd have these cities and states competing against each other to get what they think will be a windfall. I'm skeptical that any sporting event does great things for the economy, but that's a separate conversation. So that's something to worry about as well, that might end up pitting local labor movements against each other unintentionally.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of renewed skepticism because, we started this campaign pre-pandemic, and there was a lot of hope and opportunity the labor movement could leverage these conversations. Now, I think there's concern that, FIFA is stuck in time. They did some initial human rights assessments of each city, which is now completely dated. We know that we're facing a public sector crisis, a state level crisis on the unemployment issues. Our mass transit is being stressed. I know I was just talking to folks in Nashville. I mean, how are we going to move in Houston? There isn't even a good mass transit system. It's expected that 5 million people will travel to see these games. So, are we going to make investments that are long term investments that are good for the community? Or is this going to be a model where they come in, they just try to take everything they can for FIFA's own benefit? Our job is to make sure that it's the first model where they are there to make serious investments that are for the long term and the good of the community.
And here's my final question. And you kind of referenced it a few times. I thought it was great. The underlying point you kept making, which I want to highlight a little bit, is the notion in which this campaign can build power in these various communities for the long term. And one of the things that stuck with me was raising the minimum wage to at least $15 an hour and higher. By establishing and fighting over these specific things around FIFA, you can then talk to the communities that this campaign really develops about broader campaigns for workers' rights here for decades to come.
Absolutely. It's a great time to raise issues, educate the community, develop alliances so that you have a broad worker human rights coalition working on these issues. We're actually working with the fan association in each city. The fans really care that these games are done well. It also provides a wonderful opportunity for transnational organizing. We're already building campaigns with our Canadian labor movement as well as the Mexican allies. So it presents so many opportunities to rethink at the community level. What are our priorities at the transnational level? How do workers who are connected through supply chains and through these games work together to make sure they get their part in whatever the profit comes out of these games? And so I'm hopeful that there's a lot of opportunity here, and looking forward to this work in the next 5 years.
Well, even though I don't follow soccer or football, depending on how you refer to it, I'm a baseball fan. This is an important story, and I hope to bring you back and follow this as the campaign develops. And thanks for explaining it to my audience, Cathy.
Great to be here, and we welcome anyone who wants to join the campaign. I think it's going to be really exciting. So thanks for having me.
The recent election was fairly putrid if you dig deep into all the various results. And high on the list of really bad outcomes was the passage of something called Proposition 22 in California. It could be a very bad beginning to a new corporate assault on workers' rights all across the nation. The initiative tore away rights from millions of so-called gig or digital platform workers, exempting companies like Uber and Lyft from a whole range of worker protections. 5 big corporations, just 5, spent $200 million to push through the initiative, which overturned a California bill that, when that bill had passed, actually extended to folks the same rights traditional employees have, say, coverage under the minimum wage guarantee, paid sick leave, and other protections. These greedy companies who were saying gig or digital platform workers were independent contractors without basic rights, they ginned up Proposition 22, which now leaves those workers out in the cold at the mercy of these marauding multi-billion-dollar companies who exploit folks for a pittance. Let's be clear. The fancy name of gig, or digital platform workers, muddies the waters because for a very long time, powerful corporations have done everything possible to stop workers from having full employee rights, whether it's by busting a union or simply misclassifying a worker as not an actual employee, but forcing them to be independent contractors. And all those are ways to rob workers of a decent wage and basic rights at work. Progressives in Europe took notice of what happened in California and are moving as quickly as possible to make sure that the Americanization of poverty of digital platform workers is stopped at the shores of the continent. Leila Shibi, a French politician who was elected as a member of the European Parliament in 2019, is spearheading a drive to get the European Parliament to pass legislation to inscribe in law for every country in the European Union employment and working conditions for so-called gig and digital platform workers that are equal to that of more traditional workers. And from Paris, Leila joins me to talk about her proposal. And I'm curious, Leila, as we start our conversation, whether your initiative to change the law or make sure that the law in Europe protects digital platform workers, whether it was influenced by what was happening in California or in the United States, or what you were seeing already in Europe.
Yeah, you're right to say that we were inspired by what happened in California with AB5. Well, before the referendum of the 3rd of November, of course. But I think all over the world, because the situation that we have in France, we can see it all over Europe and all over the world. That situation where you have platform like Uber, Deliveroo, and they said, okay, we're going to make the connection between a customer and a driver and a rider. We're only going to make the connection. But when you look, they are hiring people officially as independent, but when you look, they practice all the characteristic of subordination, like a classic. You have people who they are supposed to be independent, but they don't have the power to fix the price. They don't have the power to say when they want to work. They don't have the power to know what is behind the algorithm. They don't have the power to know why they are disconnected or not. And in what was interesting is that we always say that in France or in Europe we have social protection that you don't have in the US. But so for us, it was very interesting to see that where Uber was born in California, even there, they managed to do a law to enforce platform to give to their workers the same right as any workers and the same social protection as any workers. And for us, it was a kind of inspiration, of course, but also it was a way during months and months we said, look, it's possible in California, so it must be possible here in France, and it must be possible in Europe.
And digital platform workers is a fancy name for something that we've had in the US for a long time, which is independent contractors. And those independent contractors have been exploited. Frankly, writers have been independent contractors as well. They've been exploited for many, many years. So it's not necessarily a new phenomena. You just have these huge, big corporations like Uber and Lyft taking advantage of it and hiring lots more people and trying to exploit the whole in the terrible labor laws we have. And what was fascinating to me as I read your important piece and your proposal, didn't European workers who were in the same boat, if I can say, back before Lyft and Uber, didn't they have protections under certain countries' laws, if not the European law?
Can you repeat the end of your question?
Well, didn't they have protections, meaning independent contractors?
Yes.
Let's say
Yes.
before Lyft and Uber, before digital platforms
Yeah.
even existed, were there
Mm.
not within Europe,
Yeah.
certainly European countries like Germany, France, the Scandinavian countries,
Mm.
did they already have protections as independent contractors,
Yeah.
meaning the right for unemployment, the right for safety and health protection, for
Mm.
certain wages? I thought the system in Europe was much better.
Yeah, but I think the main problem is not being independent, and the main problem is about bogus self-employed. So, because we when you are a worker for a company, when you work for a company, you're not a slave. Why aren't you a slave? You're not a slave because you're going to spend 8 hours working for your boss, but as you're going to give 8 hours per day to your boss, but in exchange, at the same time, you will have social protection. You will have labor law that is going to say that your boss must give you a break, for example, must give you a day off, for example, and this is the status of workers. And when you are independent, okay, you don't have all that right, but you're supposed to have freedom, autonomy. And what was invented by the platform is that they take the bad side of workers and the bad side of independent in order to create a new status. And the problem is of being a bogus self-employed, because okay, even if of course I think the independent self-employed, they would need to have more protection, but we would say, okay, they don't have the same protection as a worker, but they have some things that a worker doesn't have. For example, they can say, okay, if I want to work, I don't want to work during the morning, I'm not going to work during the morning. If I want to sell, I don't know, a pen, I'm going to say that this pen is €1, and at the same time, the worker who work for a company, the company who sell pens, they are going to say, no, it's not €1. I said it's 80 cents. But in the platform model, we have, it's a way for me that capitalism invented in order to not to apply his responsibility of employer.
So your proposal now, to just move a little bit to the proposal, and then I'm going to ask you how it gets enforced, is essentially to create under your general principles, and we don't want to get too much down in the weeds, as I like to say, but make it general. But you basically want to make sure that workers have the same rights as if they work on digital platforms as any other worker, meaning the right to have collective agreements, to have decent wages, to have the protections, the unemployment insurance, and so on, right?
Yeah. Because even now, when we were talking about the example of California with IAB5, but even when the workers, they go to the court, to the justice court, and every time, like 90% of the time, the tribunal, the judge will say, we are going to requalify your contract in a worker contract, because when we look at your contract, okay, you work for a platform that tell you how much you're going to earn. They said if they want to disconnect you or not, they control you. So all the judge say, what all the judge has said, we want to put it in the law, in the European law, in a directive. Because now, there is many directives, there is many law, European law about workers, but the problem is that the platforms are going to say, okay, it's very nice, your directive about non-discrimination of temporary workers, or they will say, it's very nice, but it's not my business, because they are not my workers, they are my partner.
That's the way they're trying to that's the way they're trying to argue here. But let me clarify something. Are you saying that in recent past or right now, judges in certain countries are actually saying these people are employees and giving them rights, and you're now trying to clarify it, right? That's what I understood.
Yeah, exactly. In many courts in France a few months ago, it was a worker from Uber, drivers against Uber. In many countries in Europe, when the workers, they go to the courts and the judge said, okay, you must have been, we just look at the situation. We don't listen to what you would like to be, what the platform would like to you to be. We just look at the situation. You are employee, and so the platform, the Uber, for example, we had during the last month hundreds of drivers that made an affair they went to the court, and so the judge said, okay, Uber must have paid. You can only go to 3 years back. So they said, okay, you should, Uber must have paid during the last 3 years for your days off, for your when you work more than the legal time, for your break. So, okay, you have to make Uber, you have to make a check to him because there must have been what we call requalification in France.
So these judges have essentially, mostly, at least in France, been pro-worker, if I can use that term, right? They have stood behind the notion that workers should have these full rights, that they do work directly for Uber.
But I don't know if they are pro-workers. It's just that
they're looking at the facts. They're looking at the facts.
Exactly. It's a fact. And
their decisions have been much more pro-worker is a better way of saying it.
Yes,
and
exactly.
So the way I understand it, what you're then trying to do is take those decisions and put them into the law of the entire continent in the European Parliament. And so my first question is going to be, have you seen support for your proposal already from other people in the Parliament? They're saying, yes, let's do it. Or do you feel like you're fighting up a very steep hill, that there's too much opposition?
No, I think I think that what is very interesting. So my proposal is when you are in order to make that the platform workers are to give access to them to the labor law and the social protection in all the member states in the European Union. And you know what? So I present. Well, first of all, in the Parliament, in the European Parliament, you know, there is several groups, and so there is in the debate there is several positions. There is it's a kind of inversion of the proof, presumption of workers. Well, in my position, to give that workers the same right as any workers, I feel that people from SND, so the socialists. People from the Green, of course, people from my group, which is left of the Green, and also even people from the right wings, they are agree. And you know what?
So, if you had to guess, just to kind of make it in a macro sense, is your gut feeling, do you have a feeling that this is going to be something that the European Parliament will eventually pass?
You know what? I am at the same time. I am optimistic and also a bit careful because I am optimistic because I see that all the judges, they are in our side. They said the same thing as we say. We can find we built a big coalition in this position. Even I met the commissioner Nicolas Schmidt to the employment and social issue 3 weeks ago to present him my proposal, and he agrees with it. He agrees. A few people now are in favor of a third status, to create a third status who would institutionalize the situation. But why I'm telling you I'm careful is that I've seen what happened in California, and I've seen that the platforms are able to pay $200 million in order to cancel a law. And I know, and I met the lobby. You know, in the European Union, there is the lobbies are very powerful, and the platforms, they have money, a lot of money, and they are very powerful. And I met the platforms. I met lobby Uber and Deliveroo, and I know that they are not going to wait, and they are very, very afraid. When I met them, they told me they were very afraid that it happens in France, in Europe, what happened in California. And also, they have someone who helps them. You know who it is? It's Macron, my president in France. Oh. The main obstacle, the main wall I have in my way in this struggle, in this fight. It's not from the right wing, it's from Renew, but which is the centrist group, but not only Renew, the French one. Macron is like the VRP, the representative of the platform, and that's the main obstacle. But I think we can win.
In the few minutes we have left, let's just touch on a few things. So in Europe, they can lobby, but do they have the same ability to spread around a lot of money to give contributions to politicians, or are they influencing government in a different way? If you can explain that in a short explanation.
I think this is different because it's true that when we learned that it's possible in the US, in California, for the platform to make a referendum to cancel a law, it was amazing for us. We were very surprised. I think this could not happen now, but it's more vicious. For example, we know that in Spain, because in Spain they are now working on a law on this issue, and we know that they are going to make to create bogus unions of workers who are made by Uber, and they're going to say, oh no, look, and we doesn't want the statute to change, and it's more they're going to meet you. It's more vicious, but they are strong, but maybe not with a mask, with more masks than in the US. Right?
So they're creating these bogus unions. We have those here too, employer-generated unions. It's a little more complicated. I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but there's no question, to your point, that these big companies like Uber are putting massive amounts of money to stop what you're trying to do in Europe, because obviously they don't want the standards set in Europe, which will then come back to the United States, because a lot of the fights we're going to have are state by state here, unless there becomes such a conflict that the federal government steps in or the Supreme Court makes a ruling about what the status is. Here's a important question for my audience. Let's say you win, or some version, because I know there's always amendments and people compromise, but you get something strong. Does every country have to abide by that? Do they have to pass it in their own countries, or can, let's say, France, because your president is opposed to it, they just say, we're not going to pay attention to this?
Okay, when you have a directive at the European level, you have each member state has 3 years to implement it at the national level. And so what in my proposal, I'm not going to say, for example, how many hours the drivers should drive. But what is said in my proposal is that in every member state where you have labor law, different labor law in every member state, you have different social protection. But since the directive is voted, in every member state, the platform workers, they have access in the labor law. They are into the labor law and into the social protection as any workers. And the member states, they have 3 years to implement it.
So each country then could then manipulate it a little bit and change some of the specifics as long as they abided by certain minimums. Is that fair to say?
They could, of course, because in the labor law you can have different level of protection. Okay. But what they could not do is saying, okay, we are not going to give to the worker the same right as any worker, because they are not workers and we are not employers. With this directive, the responsibility of the platform as employer, as boss, as a company who employ people, will be recognized.
So the last question I'll ask you is sort of to look at the overall real effort around this and the urgency of this. It's important, obviously, to protect platform workers, but I think, tell me if this is your impetus and the way you're motivated. If you don't make those standards and don't set these standards for platform workers, for, I'll call them independent contractors, that's going to undermine everybody else's rights. It's just a question of time, right? That it'll go from what we consider digital platform workers who are growing in numbers, and it'll start to affect the rights of workers in every other industry, right?
Yes, exactly. You know, a few weeks ago, I was in a demonstration from workers from Monoprix, which is a supermarket in France. And you know what? During the pandemic, in Monoprix, they discovered that they could replace the workers into the supermarket by students who were officially self-employed and that were hired by a platform for students when you look at. And so I think this fight is not only to protect, we need to protect the platform worker because, and we've seen during the pandemic that they are essential workers. We've seen how it's an emergency to give them protection, but it's a matter for all the labor world, all the economy, because now this situation that is bogus self-employed, working without having the right of a worker, now it's only for platform workers, but tomorrow it can be, if we don't do anything, tomorrow it will be for teacher, it will be for nurse, for doctor, and that's why it's okay. And also, if I can say something else, what is very, very dangerous, and I want to make the connection with, it's a different issue, but Amazon, is that kind of platform. At the beginning, they tell you, I'm only going to do the connection. But what they want is having the monopoly and destroy the one that they are supposed to connect with other one. When we see that Deliveroo, for example, the platform of delivering food, their main activity is collecting data, and with the data they have, they will know that instead of helping a restaurant, I'm going to make my own dark kitchen and restaurant. We know that Uber, they want to have a car without driver. We know that Amazon, there were complaint 2 weeks ago from the European Commission because we know that they are supposed to do the connection between shop and customer, but at the end they collect data and they destroy the customer. So I think that's another issue very important in stopping the platform to do whatever they want and just tell them there is law in Europe, in the US, and they have to respect it.
Well, thank you for taking this on and being a leader on this, and we will follow this, track this, and have you back on the show as you continue this campaign. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much. And sorry for my English is not
you were terrific. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
That'll do it for this week's broadcast. Thanks to my guests, Cathy Feingold and Leila Shibi. Again, if you're feeling bad about missing Giving Tuesday, go over to workinglife.org, look for the podcast tab, and click over there and you will see a link to Patreon where you can sign up as a one-time sponsor or a monthly supporter, or you can do that at ActBlue. Look for Working Life with Jonathan Tassini, and there you can also become a one-time sponsor or monthly sponsor. Our editor, as usual, is David Hebden. Thanks for being with us. Look forward to having you back next week.